When I saw my husband scrolling through my phone, my heart jolted, not from fear of being caught, but because he was about to see those messages. The ones I meant to delete and didn't. I reached to pull the phone from his hands, but he shifted back with a quiet certainty that told me he intended to read everything. I watched his face change line by line, as if each sentence erased a year of our life and wrote a different one over it. The room shrank, the space between us turned into a narrow bridge I was no longer sure I could cross. I heard the clock ticking like a metronome set too fast. Yes, he would learn the truth in the next minutes. But not the whole truth. His fingers trembled on the glass as he scrolled, and I knew exactly which message would undo me because it began with a single word that should never have reached his eyes. The phone buzzed in his grip. A new notification sprang up, bright as a flare. I saw his face drain when he read the sender's name. He froze. He didn't even blink. I bit the inside of my cheek, a reflex that has followed me since my first audition, my first job interview, my first wedding vow. Shame slid under my skin like cold water, and the awareness of what I had done cut through me with humiliating clarity. His breathing changed, I could hear each inhale from where I stood. This was the moment I had feared most, because 3 months ago I made a choice that shifted the axis of my quiet house, and now the consequences had arrived, tapping politely at my door and insisting on coming in. Let me tell you how it really happened, before this moment blows our calm facade to pieces. Before I share the secret I have preserved with absurd diligence, tell me in the comments which city you are watching from, and answer this: have you ever guarded a truth so carefully that, in the end, the truth guarded you instead? He moved into our house on a Tuesday so hot that the hallway smelled faintly of sun-warmed paint. The movers were late, the lift was slower than memory, and I kept asking if he had enough water as if hydration could prevent regret. He smiled with a steadiness that made people trust him. I noticed that first, how easily he quieted the hallway with that expression, how neighbors softened, how the concierge straightened his shoulders in greeting. I had not bent a room to my presence in a long time. The guest room had been a storage room for years, the kind that accumulates the sediment of a life, winter coats from when winters were colder, a treadmill we promised to love, a box of wedding gifts still wrapped in faded tissue. I folded out the blinds and opened a window, letting the afternoon heat in, because heat felt honest. He carried the heaviest boxes without a sound. I found myself narrating the house to him the way one introduces an old friend, the place where the floorboards creak, the cupboard that sticks, the balcony where geraniums refuse to die. He listened without interruption. That was new. My husband listens, but he edits, he hears me and then compresses me into headings: budget, schedule, dinner, done. My husband kissed my cheek before leaving for the airport. The kiss was precise, as if he were stamping a document. "I'll call tonight," he said. "Don't wait up." I said I wouldn't, and meant it. We have an arrangement with sleep, it visits me easier when he is gone. When the door closed, the apartment seemed to exhale. The echo took its time returning to silence, and in that interval I felt my age as a measure not of years but of rooms I have cleaned twice. The first evening with the new arrangement, one traveler, one guest, one wife, unfolded practically. We sorted shelves, argued amiably with a squeaky hinge, ate simple pasta. I noticed how he tasted the sauce, eyes narrowed, before offering a quiet suggestion: more lemon. I grated zest into the pot and felt something brighten. My husband prefers the familiar, tomato the color of old bricks, salt measured with the same spoon every time. I forgot how much I like surprises small enough to hold. I do not want to be unkind to my marriage. It is a good house with firm walls, and for many years I was content to live inside the safety of that structure. But time does a slow, patient work. It grinds the edges of desire into sand and leaves it on the windowsill, bright in the morning and gone by noon. There is nothing catastrophic about it, there is only the unremarkable habit of passing. We have dinners that taste fine. We have conversations that end in approval. We have a rhythm that does not trip. But sometimes, when I reach into the closet, my hands land on a version of myself that no longer fits. It isn't tragedy. It's tailoring. Later that night, while he adjusted a bookshelf and I wiped dust from a box labeled photos, I opened the lid and air from a younger decade rose up like perfume. There I was, a woman whose dress had a reckless hem, whose hair tried to escape pins, whose eyes looked like they trusted the answer would be yes. "You look happy," he said. Not surprised. Not polite. Observant. I studied the picture until the woman in it felt like a cousin I used to call and stopped. "It was a loud year," I said. "Loud can be good," he replied, setting the shelf in place so it stopped trembling. My husband called it 10:17. I looked at the clock because I always do, numbers are my arrangement with the universe. We told each other the day in headlines. He had a productive meeting. The hotel had improved their breakfast. The team might push the presentation to Thursday. I reported the successful conquest of a stubborn hinge and the strategic relocation of the treadmill. We both laughed in the correct places. When the call ended, the room felt too tidy. I caught my reflection in the black window and almost waved to the woman in the glass, because her mouth had arranged itself into a smile that was waiting for its reason. I slept poorly. Not because of noise, but because my mind replayed the first hour of every stage of my life, the first apartment with the mattress on the floor, the first time I could afford flowers for no reason, the first Sunday I admitted I missed being seen. Morning came like a promise kept out of obligation. I made coffee strong enough to argue back. He came into the kitchen in a t-shirt, hair still damp, and thanked me for the mug as if I had saved him. I noticed the manners we had both inherited from other lives. He rinsed his cup immediately. I folded the dish towel into thirds without thinking. The choreography of strangers who intend to be kind. I told myself it was the novelty of a new voice in the house that woke my attention. Novelty has a flair to it. It paints the same walls in a slightly different light. But later that afternoon, as we drove to the hardware store because the door to the balcony had developed a petulant lock, I realized it was not novelty I was watching for, it was responsiveness. When I said the lock stuck on humid days, he asked what else stuck when the weather changed. When I said the plants on the balcony survived me, he looked at the leaves and named them, as if things still deserved to be identified even when they were ordinary. He drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio low, a discipline that made room for conversation. In the store, I did the arithmetic of hinges and screws while he read the small print I always ignore. We chose a lock that promised less drama. The clerk asked if we wanted gift wrap, a joke delivered with a grin, and I laughed more than the line deserved. On the way home, traffic slowed near the park where the city keeps its old trees. People were out, arguing sweetly with their dogs. The world, unbothered by our private asymmetries, carried on. What do you do when your life is good on paper and ill-fitting in the margins? You adjust the margins. That was my plan, modest and sensible. I would become more deliberate with the hours. I would choose a dress not because it hid me but because it felt like a conversation with spring. I would cook something I had never cooked and perhaps get it wrong in an interesting way. I would reach for my husband with clearer intent, not the rehearsed motion of affection, but curiosity about what still lived between us. That weekend, my husband returned for a single night between trips, carrying the fatigue of airports and the smell of hotel soap. We ate takeout in the living room, because none of us had the will to pretend the table would make it better. He asked practical questions about the new lock and praised the absence of squeak. He thanked our guest for replacing a light bulb in the hallway. We watched the second half of a movie and the first half of a conversation about it, then drifted apart inside the same room, as if the furniture had been arranged for 3 people who had learned to orbit. I went to bed first. My husband joined later, his arm finding me the way a hand finds a familiar railing. I lay awake listening to his breathing fall into the old pattern that had been my lullaby for years. I counted its predictability and tried not to resent it. Memory does not organize itself like a spreadsheet. It prefers the collage, this lamp, that tone of voice, the shine of lemon zest on pasta. When I think of the days that followed, what returns first is the sound of keys in the bowl, the polite knock on the kitchen door before he walked in, the way he paused before speaking, as if testing the air for weather. He took on small tasks without announcement, and the apartment began to run more smoothly, which is to say, I did. My husband noticed the results and praised the efficiency. He has always been good at gratitude, the formal kind. The intimate variety, gratitude that turns into a touch, into a question you don't rush, has always been rarer for us, not through malice, but through habit. If you are expecting a bolt of drama to split the sky and rearrange me, it did not happen. The truth arrived like rain that begins as a rumor. A glance held a fraction too long. A laugh that landed where it had not been aiming. My reflection in the kettle as water began to whisper. These are small things. But small things, accrued, are a ledger. Somewhere in those quiet days, I remembered the particular pleasure of being watched for no reason at all. I remembered that my body is a language I speak to myself even when no one is listening. I did not rename my longing, I acknowledged its competence. On the Monday that changes the weather of this story, the city woke to a wind that pushed clouds across the sky like heavy furniture. I changed the sheets in the guest room because doing keeps me safer than thinking. As I folded the last corner, my husband texted that flights were a mess and he might be back midweek, or not. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, not because I worried for him, I did, in the practical way one worries for anyone traveling, but because of the unremarkable relief that followed. Then I felt ashamed of that feeling and changed the pillowcases again, as if cotton could absolve me. I want to say I did not notice the moment when attention turned into anticipation. But I did. I noticed it when I began to plan dinner not around my husband's preferences but around the surprise of a recipe I had saved long ago. I noticed it when a dress I had not worn in years asked to see light and I let it. I noticed it when I walked past mirrors slower than usual, not to admire, but to confirm, yes, there is still a person here, and she is legible. If a life is composed of rooms, then that week I opened a door I had kept locked out of politeness. I stood on the threshold and did not step through. Not yet. There is a difference between an opening and a crossing. But the handle turned easily in my hand, and that, too, told me something I had not wanted to hear. Morning thinned the night into a pale ribbon along the window. I made a list to give the day structure: groceries, laundry, the stubborn balcony lock. Coffee steamed in my cup, anchoring me to small certainties. I wore a cotton dress for comfort, nothing more, and told myself the day would stay ordinary. He appeared in the doorway with a book under his arm, pausing before entering. He thanked me for coffee with a quiet nod. We ate toast, spoke of errands, his to the campus, mine to the market. Our words kept their distance, yet the air between them seemed charged with an unspoken readiness. At the market, fruit was stacked in careful pyramids. I bought lemons, remembering his earlier suggestion, adding one more without thinking. A woman at the cheese stall asked after my husband's travels. I replied politely, hiding behind the easy wall of small talk. Back home, the guest room door stood open. His tools for the lock were laid out neatly, each in its place. I admired the order, then reminded myself that gratitude need not lead to anything further. By afternoon, heat pressed against the windows. We worked on the balcony in a sliver of shade, passing the screwdriver back and forth. A neighbor's watering can spilled drops onto our railing. The lock yielded at last, swinging cleanly. Inside, I made lunch. He set glasses on the table, waiting before sitting, a courtesy I noticed but did not comment on. We ate quietly. He asked if I could collect his mail later in the week. I gave the dates in code. Such ordinary words, yet my pulse betrayed me. After lunch, he left for campus. I cleaned, avoiding the phone when unfamiliar numbers rang. His text came an hour later. The office was closed, he'd be back soon. I smiled at the screen, then turned it face down, rearranging lemons as if that task mattered. He returned with a new bolt for the lock and coffee beans in a paper bag. The aroma filled the apartment. We installed the bolt quickly, pleased by the crisp click of the latch. I stood on the balcony a moment, letting the air touch my face. Clouds gathered as evening approached. I suggested we bring in the cushions before the air turned damp. In the narrow doorway, our hands overlapped on a cushion. The pause that followed was deliberate. I looked up to find his eyes on mine, not in surprise, but in steady acknowledgement. We kissed. We stepped back, the space between us small but deliberate. I set the cushion down, and life resumed its surface rhythm. He carried the coffee to the kitchen. I washed my hands, the cool water a quiet punctuation. The grinder hummed. We drank coffee and spoke of trivial things, the neighbor's dog, the stubborn campus office, the satisfying new lock. I didn't ask what he was thinking. Some moments are safer unexamined. Later, I called my husband. I told him about the market, the repaired lock, the overcast sky. He spoke of flight delays and impersonal hotel pillows. We exchanged news with the efficiency of people who trust information more than intimacy. After the call, I folded laundry with unusual precision. He wiped the counter, leaving the cloth folded neatly, mirroring my habit. The small echo unsettled me more than I expected. I went to my room earlier than usual, lying in the quiet and listening to the apartment, water in the pipes, a drawer closing in the guest room. My heartbeat slowed, but the memory of that doorway pause, the shared weight of the cushion, stayed vivid. If the city keeps a record of its smallest trespasses, today's entry would be brief. 2 people fixed a lock, carried cushions, and crossed a waiting distance. The door now opens easily, and I know who turned the handle. The following morning began with the faint sound of rain brushing the balcony rail. It was the kind of weather that made the apartment feel smaller, the walls holding the damp air close. I moved through my routine with deliberate calm, making coffee, setting the table, opening the blinds just enough to let in the pale light. The market bags still sat by the counter from the day before, and I unpacked them slowly, as if putting each item in its place would also arrange my thoughts. He emerged from the hallway, hair slightly disheveled, wearing a sweatshirt that looked softened by years of wear. He thanked me for the coffee, and we spoke briefly about the rain. Our words floated easily, untouched by the pause from yesterday. If anything, there was a strange steadiness in the way we moved around each other, careful, measured, and without the awkwardness one might expect after crossing a boundary. After breakfast, he mentioned an errand at the bookstore near the square. I had my own list, a replacement light bulb for the hallway fixture, bread from the bakery, a stop at the dry cleaner. We decided to walk together part of the way. The streets glistened under the drizzle, reflecting muted colors from the shopfronts. The city felt subdued, as if it had agreed to speak in a lower voice for the day. We walked without urgency. Occasionally, our shoulders aligned, the rhythm of our steps matching. Passing the florist's stall, I slowed, looking at the display of chrysanthemums. He noticed but didn't comment, letting the pause sit between us before moving on. At the corner, we split, he to the bookstore, I to the bakery, agreeing to meet at the coffee shop later. The bakery was warm and fragrant, the air thick with the scent of fresh loaves. I chose one with a dark crust, remembering how quickly bread disappeared in the house now. At the dry cleaner, the clerk asked about my husband's jacket, noting she hadn't seen him in some time. I answered lightly, mentioning his travels, and accepted the ticket for pickup. When I reached the coffee shop, he was already there, a book on the table beside his cup. He looked up and smiled in a way that was not practiced, just present. I ordered tea, and we sat by the window, watching the rain shift from a fine mist to heavier drops. We talked about the book he'd found, the kind of details that wander from topic to topic. There was no need to fill every silence, the quiet carried its own texture. Back at the apartment, I set the bread on the counter and began making soup for later. He changed a light bulb without being asked, then disappeared briefly into the guest room. The sounds of tools moving reached me faintly, metal against wood, the small thud of something set aside. It was comforting, the way his presence seemed to mend both objects and spaces without asking for notice. In the afternoon, the rain stopped, leaving the air cool and fresh. I opened the balcony door to let it in. He joined me there, leaning lightly on the railing. We spoke about nothing urgent, the slow changes in the neighborhood, the quiet apartments across the courtyard. There was a stillness in that shared view, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. As evening drew closer, I started setting the table. The soup had settled into its flavor, and I sliced the bread while he arranged glasses. Our movements were coordinated without discussion. The first spoonful warmed me in a way that wasn't entirely from the heat. We ate slowly, talking about the week ahead. My husband's name came up only briefly, in the context of his return date. The word Thursday hung in the air a moment longer than the rest. After dinner, he offered to wash the dishes. I agreed, drying them as he passed them to me. The domestic rhythm felt unfamiliar in its ease. By the time the kitchen was in order, the day had folded itself into the kind of quiet that precedes night. I went to my room early, taking a book I knew I wouldn't finish. The apartment settled around me, the sound of water in the pipes, the faint click of the guest room door, the shuffle of feet on the hall rug. Lying there, I thought about how small the changes had been so far. And yet, each one seemed to tilt the balance of the house just slightly, like shifting weight from one foot to the other. I closed my eyes, the rain's memory still in the air, and wondered how long such careful balance could hold. The next morning began with a sharp brightness pouring through the window, as if the city had decided to erase every trace of yesterday's rain. The air carried a faint chill, but the light had that clean clarity that makes everything seem more defined. I moved through the kitchen quietly, measuring coffee, slicing fruit, listening to the muffled hum of the building. The bread from the day before sat on the counter, its crust still crisp, and I cut a few pieces to warm in the oven. He arrived soon after, hair still damp from a shower, wearing a dark sweater that contrasted with the sunlight falling across the table. He thanked me for breakfast in that measured tone of his, neither overly formal nor careless. We spoke briefly about the weather and the brightness of the morning. There was something about the way the light struck his face that made me look away too quickly, focusing instead on the coffee, on pouring without spilling. After breakfast, I suggested we sort through a box of old things that had been sitting in the hallway for months. It was the kind of task I had been postponing, but with someone else there, it seemed less tedious. We carried the box to the living room, the cardboard edges worn and soft from age. Inside were stacks of photographs, envelopes, postcards with handwriting that leaned and curved like conversations. We spread them out on the coffee table, and I began to explain the origins of each pile. He listened, occasionally lifting a photograph to study it closer. One image caught his attention, a picture of me taken decades ago, standing in a crowded street, my coat buttoned against the wind, my hair pulled back loosely. I noticed the way he examined it, not with idle curiosity, but as if trying to read something in it. "You look different here," he said, and I answered simply, "It was a loud year." He smiled faintly, not asking for more, and placed the photograph carefully back in the pile. Sorting through the rest of the box took longer than I expected. Each object carried its own small story, and in telling them, I realized how much of my life was stored in fragments. some things I set aside to keep, others to throw away. He helped without judgment, handing me envelopes, stacking papers, discarding what I pointed to. The work felt less like cleaning and more like revisiting an older version of myself. By midday, we had reduced the contents of the box by half. The living room looked tidier, the table cleared. I made lunch, soup from the night before, reheated with fresh herbs, and a salad assembled from what we had. He set the table, moving quietly between the cupboards and drawers, as if he had already learned where everything belonged. We ate without rush, the conversation drifting from the photos to the changes in the city, to small errands that still needed doing. After lunch, I washed the dishes while he stepped out to the balcony, leaning on the railing, looking out toward the street. The sun was stronger now, catching the tops of the trees and the windows across the courtyard. I joined him for a moment, the air cool despite the brightness. From up there, the street noise felt distant, softened by the height. In the afternoon, we decided to walk to the park. The path was scattered with fallen leaves, the colors deepening into golds and browns. The air smelled faintly of damp earth, even though the ground was dry. We didn't talk much on the way, but the silence didn't feel empty. Passing a bench near the pond, I paused to watch the water ripple where ducks moved lazily across. He stood beside me, hands in his pockets, following my gaze. We stayed until the light began to fade, then made our way back. The apartment felt warmer after the cool air outside. I set the kettle to boil for tea, and he moved about the kitchen without instruction, taking down mugs, finding the sugar. We drank in the living room, the television on low in the background, showing a news program we barely listened to. As evening settled in, I began preparing dinner, roasted vegetables and rice, something simple but filling. He stayed nearby, occasionally offering to chop or stir. The air in the kitchen filled with the scent of rosemary and garlic, a comforting blend that made the apartment feel smaller, more contained. We ate at the table, talking about nothing in particular, the kind of conversation that flows easily when neither person is trying too hard. After dinner, he offered again to handle the dishes. I let him, drying each plate he passed to me, stacking them neatly. When the kitchen was done, the rest of the apartment felt quiet, as if the day had settled into itself. I went to my room with a book, intending to read, but instead sat by the window for a long while, watching the last traces of light fade from the sky. The day had been simple, shared meals, a walk, sorting through photographs. And yet, in the spaces between those ordinary moments, there was an awareness I couldn't quite name. It lingered as I turned off the lamp and lay down, the memory of the photograph still vivid in my mind, as if the woman in it had been waiting for me to notice her again. The morning began with a quiet that felt heavier than usual. Sunlight edged its way through the blinds, drawing thin lines across the floor. I moved through the kitchen slowly, the rhythm of the coffee grinder and the sound of water boiling grounding me in familiar motions. The air was cool, carrying that faint scent of overnight dew drifting in through the balcony door I had left slightly ajar. He appeared not long after, holding a small stack of mail he had picked up from downstairs. He set it on the counter without comment, offering a brief nod before moving to pour himself coffee. We spoke lightly about the day ahead. I mentioned a trip to the garden shop for soil and a few new plants for the balcony. He said he would come along, noting it was better to carry the heavier bags together. The offer was casual, but it settled into the day as if it had always been planned. At the garden shop, the scent of damp earth and greenery wrapped around us. I wandered between the rows, running my fingers lightly over leaves, inspecting flowers still curled from the early hour. He carried the basket, occasionally suggesting a plant or two. We debated over the best choice for the shaded corner of the balcony, finally agreeing on something hardy and understated. On the way back, the weight of the bags shifted between us, an easy exchange that required no words. Back at the apartment, we set the plants out on the balcony, arranging them before filling each pot with fresh soil. The work was simple, but the act of doing it together made the space feel more alive. My hands were smudged with dirt, and when I brushed a stray hair from my forehead, I left a faint mark across my temple. He noticed and reached out instinctively, his thumb brushing the smudge away. We kissed. The moment was brief, without preamble or discussion, but it carried a quiet certainty. When we stepped back, neither of us spoke about it. I picked up the watering can, finishing the task at hand. He adjusted one of the pots so it caught more light. The balcony air felt heavier now, though the sky was still clear. We moved back inside, each slipping into our own small tasks. I washed my hands, the cool water cutting through the warmth that lingered in my skin. He gathered the empty soil bags to take down to the recycling bins. I listened to the sound of the door closing behind him, followed by the faint echo of footsteps in the hallway. When he returned, I had already started lunch, roasted vegetables and fresh bread from the day before. We ate at the table, the conversation easy and light. We spoke about the plants, the way the balcony already looked different, and the possibility of adding a small table out there for the warmer days ahead. His tone was steady, as if the morning's moment hadn't altered the shape of our interactions. But beneath the words, there was an unspoken recognition that something had shifted. In the afternoon, he worked in the guest room, sorting through his things. I stayed in the living room, reading but barely turning the pages. Every sound from down the hall pulled at my attention, the opening of a drawer, the movement of boxes, the creak of the floor under his steps. Eventually, he came in to ask about the nearest hardware store, and I told him, though I suspected he already knew. The exchange was brief, but his eyes lingered just a moment longer than necessary before he left. When he returned later with a small bag from the store, he set it down on the counter and began replacing the old screws in one of the kitchen cabinet doors. I offered to help, but he shook his head, working with quiet efficiency. I made tea while he finished the repair, and we sat together in the living room afterward, the television on low but neither of us paying much attention to it. As evening approached, I started preparing dinner. He stayed nearby, passing me ingredients or stirring a pot when I asked. The motions between us felt natural, unforced, yet the undercurrent of the day remained present, shaping the space between each movement. We ate without rush, talking about errands for the rest of the week. My husband's name came up briefly when I mentioned needing to confirm his travel plans, and the conversation shifted quickly back to practical matters. After dinner, he handled the dishes again while I dried them. The routine had become a quiet ritual, one that filled the kitchen with the gentle sound of water and the occasional clink of plates. When everything was put away, I stepped out onto the balcony to check the plants. The evening air was cooler, and the city lights were beginning to flicker on in the distance. I stayed there a while, listening to the muted sounds from inside, until the chill pushed me back indoors. I went to my room earlier than usual, closing the door softly behind me. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I thought about how easily the day had folded itself around that one brief moment, the way it had left no visible trace yet altered everything in subtle ways. The plants on the balcony would take root and grow, and so, it seemed, would the quiet shift between us. The next morning brought a steady wind that rattled the balcony railing and carried the scent of distant rain. The sky was layered with clouds, each shade of gray folding into the next. I stood in the kitchen, the kettle just beginning to hum, listening to the restless air outside. The plants we had arranged yesterday swayed gently, their leaves twitching with each gust. He entered quietly, carrying a folded sweater over one arm. He set it down on the back of a chair and reached for a mug without a word. Our movements in the kitchen had taken on a rhythm, an ease that needed no instruction. We spoke briefly about the wind, how it might bring a storm later in the day. I noticed that his voice was steady, unhurried, yet it carried a certain weight, as if his thoughts were moving elsewhere. Breakfast was simple tea, toast, fruit, and the last of the bread we had bought earlier in the week. Between sips of coffee, we reviewed a short list of errands. I had laundry to finish. He mentioned needing to stop by a store in the afternoon. The exchange was practical, but behind each sentence I could feel an awareness neither of us was naming. Later in the morning, while I sorted laundry, I heard the faint sound of a toolbox opening in the guest room. The clicks of metal and wood reached me through the hallway. When I passed by to carry a basket to the washer, he was kneeling by the window frame, tightening a hinge that had been loose for months. I paused briefly, thanked him, and kept moving. The laundry cycle's low, constant hum filled the apartment. By midday, the wind had grown stronger, pushing shadows across the walls as clouds shifted overhead. I suggested we close the balcony door for a while to keep the air from becoming too cold inside. He agreed, securing the latch with a firm click. The sudden stillness in the room after the door shut was noticeable, as if a boundary had been re-established. Lunch was made from what we had, soup reheated from the day before and a small salad. We ate without rushing, conversation threading through small topics, a neighbor's new car, changes to the nearby park, the weather forecast for the week. There was a calm to the exchange, though at times I caught him watching me in those moments when I wasn't speaking. It wasn't a stare, but an observation that lingered a fraction longer than necessary. In the early afternoon, he left for his errand, taking his jacket against the wind. The apartment felt larger in his absence, but not quieter, just different, the sounds more distant. I used the time to finish the laundry and tidy the kitchen. Folding clothes in neat stacks, I tried to focus on the rhythm of the task, but my mind wandered back to the small moments of the past few days, replaying them with unnecessary precision. He returned just as I was putting away the last of the clean linens. The door closed softly behind him, followed by the sound of a paper bag set on the counter. Inside were a few items for the apartment, a new sponge, a roll of twine, and batteries we had needed for the kitchen clock. He placed them neatly in their spots, and I thanked him. The ease of this domestic cooperation was disarming in its simplicity. As the afternoon faded toward evening, the wind shifted, carrying a damp edge that suggested rain wasn't far off. I stepped out to the balcony to check the plants, making sure the lighter pots were in a sheltered corner. He joined me there, leaning on the railing. From this height, the street below looked blurred in the dimming light, the outlines of people moving quickly against the coming weather. It was during that pause that he spoke, almost casually, about how my husband seemed to travel more often lately. The words were light, but the question inside them was clear. I answered with a neutral tone, mentioning that his work required it. He nodded, as if he had expected that response, but his gaze didn't shift away. Then, almost as if adding an afterthought, he said he'd once seen him at a restaurant downtown, not alone. The words hung between us, neither confirmed nor denied. I felt a slight tightening in my chest, though I kept my voice even when I asked when that had been. He told me it was a few weeks ago, a passing glance from across the room. No details, no embellishment. The quiet that followed felt heavier than the clouds above. We returned inside, and I went to the kitchen to start dinner, roasted potatoes, steamed vegetables, and a simple sauce. He helped without being asked, washing the vegetables and arranging them on the cutting board. Our coordination was seamless, but the earlier exchange lingered in my mind. We ate in near silence, the occasional clink of cutlery marking the pauses. When the plates were cleared, he offered to wash while I dried. The water running in the sink filled the space where conversation might have been. By the time the kitchen was in order, the rain had started, tapping softly at the balcony door. I stood for a while watching it, the streetlights casting a blurred glow on the wet pavement. He passed through the room, heading toward the guest space, and the sound of the door closing behind him marked the end of the day's shared spaces. In my own room, the rain's steady rhythm made the air feel heavier. I thought about what he had said, the way he had left it without pressing for a reaction. The apartment, once a place of routine, now held layers I was only beginning to notice, quiet shifts in balance, each one altering the weight of what we both carried but did not name. The morning came with a pale, hazy light that barely pushed through the clouded sky. The rain from the night before had stopped, leaving the streets below slick and reflective, and the air inside the apartment carried a faint chill. I moved quietly through the kitchen, the sounds of boiling water and the slow grind of coffee beans filling the stillness. The balcony plants, beaded with drops, leaned slightly toward the muted light. He joined me without hurry, his hair still damp from a shower, the faint scent of soap carried with him. We exchanged the usual greetings, our voices low, and began breakfast, bread lightly toasted, a wedge of cheese, coffee poured into heavy mugs. Our conversation stayed in the realm of the practical, small errands, the groceries we might need, the day's weather. Yet under the surface of these harmless exchanges, the weight of the previous evening's words lingered. By mid-morning, the clouds began to break in thin, uneven stretches, and the apartment felt a little brighter. I decided to reorganize a cupboard in the kitchen, the kind of task that kept my hands busy enough to quiet restless thoughts. He appeared after a while, offering to help, and together we unpacked jars and containers, wiping the shelves before placing everything back in some better order. The work was simple, but our movements were in sync, as though the silence between us had become its own kind of coordination. Around noon, he mentioned going out for a short walk. I hesitated before agreeing to come along. The air outside was fresh and sharp with the smell of wet pavement. We walked without urgency, our steps aligning naturally, passing shop fronts and street corners still drying from the rain. At one point, a gust of wind scattered a cluster of leaves across our path, and for a brief second, the quiet weight in my chest lifted. We stopped by a small cafe tucked into a side street. Inside, the warmth was immediate, the air scented with coffee and fresh pastries. We sat by the window, watching the street as we sipped our drinks. The talk drifted, an observation about the cafe's old photographs on the wall, a comment on how quickly the season seemed to be changing. It was ordinary, but it also felt like a space where the tension of the past few days could breathe without spilling over. Back at the apartment, the afternoon light had turned golden and thin, stretching long shadows across the floor. I began preparing an early dinner, chopping vegetables while he measured rice. We didn't speak much, but there was no discomfort in the quiet. Instead, it felt as though the day was gathering itself towards something neither of us had yet named aloud. As the food cooked, he stepped out to the balcony, and I followed after a moment. The city below was settling into its early evening pace, lights coming on in windows, the hum of distant traffic, voices echoing from the street. He leaned on the railing, looking out, and I found myself standing closer than I intended. There was no rush, no suddenness, just a gradual closing of space between us. When his eyes met mine, I didn't look away. The air was cool against my skin, but his nearness was warm, grounding. We stood like that for what felt like a long time, the background sounds of the city fading into something less distinct. We spent the night together. The details of the evening unfolded without hurry. Dinner was eaten in low light, the conversation muted but steady. Afterward, we cleared the table in near silence, each movement deliberate. The apartment felt smaller, the edges of rooms more defined, as though the walls themselves had taken notice. Later, in the quiet of my own room, the sounds from the rest of the apartment reached me faintly, the creak of the guest room door, the low hum of water running in the pipes. I lay still, the day replaying itself in fragments, the walk through drying streets, the warmth of the cafe, the moment on the balcony when neither of us stepped back. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the return of routine. But for that night, the space between past and future felt suspended, held in a balance I didn't yet know how to name. The morning after carried a stillness that seemed unusual for the apartment. The air was cool, with a pale light spilling through the partially drawn blinds, and the usual rhythm of the building outside felt slower. I woke earlier than usual, the sense of time feeling slightly disjointed. Moving quietly, I went to the kitchen and began to make coffee, focusing on the familiar sequence of motions, the scoop of beans, the steady grind, the sound of water heating. The plants on the balcony swayed faintly in the light wind, their leaves moving as though they were aware of a change in the air. He appeared a few minutes later, his steps soft against the hallway floor. There was no rush in his movements, but something in the way he carried himself felt different, calm, almost deliberate. He offered a brief good morning and poured coffee into a mug, taking a seat at the table. Our words were minimal, practical, as we shared the space without discussing the shift between us. After breakfast, I began tidying the kitchen while he disappeared briefly into the guest room. I could hear him moving items around, the dull scrape of a chair, the faint sound of a drawer sliding open. I kept my focus on the dishes, methodically rinsing and drying them, but every noise from down the hall pulled at my attention. Later in the morning, I decided to step out for groceries. The air outside was brisk, the sidewalks dotted with puddles from last night's rain. The market was quiet, with a handful of early shoppers moving through the aisles. I bought bread, a few vegetables, and some fruit, lingering briefly at the display of flowers before moving on. The walk back felt longer, my thoughts circling around the sense of a new arrangement in the apartment, subtle but unmistakable. When I returned, he was in the living room repairing the small table near the window. The tools were laid out neatly beside him, and he worked without looking up until I set the grocery bag on the counter. I thanked him for taking care of it, and he nodded, continuing until the loose leg of the table no longer wobbled. We spent part of the afternoon in our own corners of the apartment, he reading in the guest room, I folding laundry in the bedroom. Every so often, we crossed paths in the hallway or kitchen, exchanging a brief comment or glance before moving on. It was ordinary, yet every interaction carried the quiet knowledge of the night before, as though both of us were choosing to let it settle into the background rather than bring it into direct focus. By mid-afternoon, the light had shifted, stretching shadows across the floor. I decided to cook something simple for dinner, a vegetable stew that would simmer for a while, filling the apartment with warmth. He offered to chop some of the ingredients, and we worked side by side at the counter. The steady rhythm of chopping and stirring felt grounding, each motion easing the unspoken tension that hovered at the edges of the day. While the stew cooked, we stepped out to the balcony. The wind had eased, and the city below was in the midst of its early evening shuffle. People moved along the sidewalks with grocery bags, children's voices rose from the courtyard, and the faint hum of traffic filled the air. We stood in silence for a while, watching the light fade. There was no need to speak, the quiet was its own form of agreement. Dinner was ready as the first of the city lights flickered on outside. We ate slowly, the conversation light, touching only on practical topics, the groceries for the next day, a package he was expecting, the forecast for the weekend. The simplicity of the meal and the ease of the exchange kept the moment grounded, free of any pressure to define or explain what didn't need to be put into words just yet. After dinner, he cleared the table while I wiped down the counters. The clink of plates and the low sound of running water filled the space between us. Once the kitchen was in order, he returned to the living room with a book, while I sat near the balcony door, looking out at the street below. The apartment felt balanced, the weight of the day held in a kind of careful suspension. When it was time to retreat to our separate rooms, the movement was natural. No conversation marked the transition, only the soft sound of doors closing. In my room, I turned off the lamp and let the quiet settle fully. The night outside was calm, and inside, the apartment felt steady, almost deliberate in its silence. I lay there for a while, aware that routine would return quickly enough. But for now, it was enough to note that the space we shared had shifted, not loudly, but in a way that could not be undone. The day began with a muted light creeping in through the curtains, the kind that made the apartment feel wrapped in a layer of stillness. I moved through the kitchen in slow, deliberate motions, measuring coffee, slicing fruit, setting the table without hurry. The weather outside looked unsettled, a pale sky streaked with thin clouds that hinted at wind later in the day. The plants on the balcony swayed slightly, their leaves whispering against each other. He entered a few minutes later, wearing a dark jacket as if already planning to go out. He greeted me with a nod, his voice low, and reached for a mug. Breakfast was quiet, the words between us minimal. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, but rather the kind where both people are measuring the day ahead before it begins. After we finished eating, he mentioned needing to run an errand across town. I told him I had laundry to finish and a bit of cleaning to do, and that I might also stop by the market in the afternoon. Our exchange was short, almost routine, but his tone carried a calm assurance, as if the unspoken events of the past days had found their place in the rhythm of the apartment. By mid-morning, the sound of his steps faded down the hallway as he left. The apartment felt larger in his absence, but it also felt exposed, as if the quiet now revealed things that were easier to ignore when we shared the same rooms. I gathered the laundry, started the first load, and began wiping down surfaces in the kitchen. The small tasks kept my hands busy, though my thoughts wandered back to moments I didn't intend to dwell on. Around noon, I heard a soft knock at the door. It was the neighbor from across the hall, holding a misdelivered envelope. We spoke briefly in the doorway about the building's maintenance schedule and the possibility of water shutoffs later in the week. As she turned to leave, she glanced past me into the apartment, her eyes lingering just long enough to notice the extra shoes near the door. She didn't comment, but the pause was clear before she offered a polite smile and walked away. I set the envelope on the counter and went back to folding laundry, though the exchange left a faint unease in its wake. It wasn't suspicion exactly, just an awareness that the life inside these walls was not invisible, no matter how quietly it was lived. In the early afternoon, I took a short walk to the market. The air outside had shifted, the wind was stronger now, carrying with it the smell of something sharp and metallic, like rain waiting just beyond the edge of the city. I bought bread, a few vegetables, and eggs, keeping the trip brief. On the way back, I caught sight of the same neighbor talking to someone near the mailboxes. They didn't look in my direction, but I didn't linger to give them the chance. When I returned, he was already back, sitting in the living room with a notebook open on his lap. He looked up as I set the groceries on the counter, asking if I needed help putting them away. We worked together quietly, the rhythm between us unbroken. He told me his errand had taken longer than expected, then let the conversation drift to small details about the route he'd walked. Later in the afternoon, the sky darkened in patches, and the wind rattled the balcony railing. I stepped outside to move the lighter pots to a safer corner, and he joined me, holding the door open as I carried them. We stayed there for a moment, looking out at the uneven clouds moving quickly overhead. The city below seemed restless, its sounds sharper in the wind. Inside, I started preparing an early dinner. He stayed nearby, peeling vegetables while I chopped. The motions were steady, almost meditative. At one point, he asked about the neighbor, mentioning he'd passed her in the hallway earlier. I told him about the envelope, keeping my voice neutral, though I noticed the way his expression shifted briefly, as if filing away the information. Dinner was ready before the sun had fully set. We ate slowly, the conversation light, touching on plans for the next day. My husband's name came up only in passing, when I mentioned needing to check his travel updates. The mention was brief, almost as if saying it too directly might disturb the balance of the table. After the meal, he cleared the plates and washed the dishes while I dried them. The sound of running water and the clink of glass filled the kitchen. When everything was put away, I stepped onto the balcony one last time before nightfall. The wind had eased slightly, but the air was cooler, carrying with it the smell of damp streets. From the balcony, The glow of streetlights painted the wet pavement below in a patchwork of gold and shadow. The neighbor's window across the courtyard was lit, a faint outline moving behind the curtain. I stayed only a moment before going back inside, closing the door softly behind me. In my room, I turned off the lamp and let the quiet settle. The apartment felt contained, but the day had left a faint thread of tension running through it. Somewhere between the errands, the market, and the brief conversation in the hallway, I knew that the life we were shaping here was balanced on the edge of being noticed. The next morning arrived with a brightness that felt too sharp after so many days of muted light. Sun poured through the blinds in long, uninterrupted lines, catching dust in the air and warming the floor beneath the table. I moved slowly, letting the apartment wake in its own time. The coffee pot burbled quietly, and the scent filled the kitchen, spreading into the hallway. He came in wearing a plain shirt, sleeves rolled halfway up, his expression unreadable but calm. We exchanged a quiet greeting, and he poured himself coffee before sitting. The air between us was steady, unhurried, as though the days that had built to this moment were waiting just behind the edges of our morning routine. We ate in silence for the first few minutes. My husband's return was expected that day, earlier than planned, but not unexpected enough to give me an excuse to be startled. The thought of it sat in the back of my mind like a weight I couldn't quite shift. Every movement, every clink of a cup on the table, felt like it might carry into the hours ahead. After breakfast, he moved to the guest room, closing the door partway as he began packing a small bag. I busied myself in the living room, dusting the shelves and straightening the cushions, the motions mechanical. The clock in the hallway seemed louder than usual, its ticking marking time more precisely than I wanted. By mid-morning, I heard the familiar sound of a key turning in the front door. My husband stepped inside, suitcase in one hand, his jacket draped over the other. His eyes moved over the room, then to me, and finally toward the open space of the hallway where the guest room door stood ajar. His face was calm, too calm, like a surface of water hiding something deep beneath. He set his suitcase down and asked how the past week had been. I gave him a careful summary: errands, the plants on the balcony, the repairs in the kitchen, each detail chosen for its neutrality. He listened, his gaze steady, before nodding once and removing his jacket. A moment later, he looked toward the guest room again and called for him to come out. There was no edge in his tone, no sharpness, just the weight of someone accustomed to being answered. He stepped into the hallway, his expression unchanged, and the two of them exchanged a brief nod, acknowledgement without greeting. We moved to the kitchen, my husband sitting at the table while I poured him coffee. He spoke in that same even voice, saying he'd been aware for some time of what had been happening. The words didn't fall like an accusation, they landed like a fact already considered, filed away, and accepted. He went on to say that he hadn't intended to confront it immediately, but circumstances had shifted, and now it seemed the simplest thing to be honest. Then he told me, without hesitation, that he had been seeing someone else for months. The sentence arrived without warning, but it explained the absences, the moments of distraction, the phone calls taken in another room. It should have felt like a blow, but instead it was strangely leveling, as if a balance had been struck without either of us planning it. The kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. He sipped his coffee, watching me, waiting for a response. I found none that would change the shape of what had been said. My hands rested lightly on the table, steady despite the weight of the moment. He didn't ask for an explanation, and I didn't offer one. There was no scene, no raised voices, just the quiet understanding that whatever we had been holding onto had shifted into something else entirely. He stood, picked up his suitcase, and said he would be staying elsewhere for a few days. When the door closed behind him, the apartment seemed to exhale. The air felt different, lighter in one way, heavier in another. He remained in the guest room for a while, the sound of movement faint but steady. Eventually, he emerged with a small bag slung over his shoulder. We didn't speak much as he moved toward the door. The look we exchanged was not an agreement, not a promise, but a recognition of something neither of us could take back. He stepped out, and the door shut with a muted click that left the apartment still. I stood in the living room for a long time after, the sunlight still cutting across the floor, unchanged by the shift that had just occurred. The plants on the balcony swayed gently in the breeze, their leaves catching the light. In the silence, I became aware of my own breathing, slow, even, and steady, filling the space that now belonged entirely to me.